The Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, Part 1. Writing his life story. In 1771, at the age of 65, Benjamin Franklin begins writing Part 1 of his autobiography while on vacation in England. He addresses his son, William, the royal governor of New Jersey, expressing his pleasure in hearing stories about family members. Franklin suggests that William might enjoy learning about his father's life, and this leisurely period is the perfect time to set it down on paper. Unusual life trajectory. Franklin acknowledges that his life trajectory, from an obscure tradesman to a renowned statesman, is somewhat unusual. Beyond mere entertainment for his son, he believes his story might be worthy of imitation. He humorously reflects that if given the chance, he would live his whole life over again, correcting a few errors, errata, made the first time around. Recollection and vanity. Franklin contends that recollecting and writing down one's life is the closest thing to living it over. He admits that vanity plays a role in writing the autobiography. He believes vanity is beneficial for both the vain person and those around them. Franklin expresses gratitude to God, attributing everything good that has happened to divine providence. The Franklin family history. Franklin learns from his uncle's notes that the Franklin family lived in the English village of Ecton, Northamptonshire, for at least 300 years. The family tradition involved training the eldest son of each generation as a smith. Consulting the Ecton registry, Franklin discovers that he is the youngest son of the youngest son going back 5 generations. Thomas Jr. and John. Franklin describes seeing his grandfather Thomas Sr.'s gravestone in Banbury, Oxfordshire. Thomas Jr., Franklin's uncle, was initially a smith but later became a scrivener, scribe, esteemed by the community and gentry. John, another of Thomas Sr.'s sons, was an ingenious silk dyer. He developed his own shorthand writing method, transcribing sermons and dabbling in politics. Family composition and religious tensions. Franklin's family was composed of Protestants, which sometimes put them in danger when Catholics like Queen Mary were in power. An anecdote reveals how Franklin's family concealed an English Bible under a joint stool to avoid religious persecution by apparitors. Josiah and Abia Folger. Franklin's father, Josiah, and his uncle Benjamin broke away from the Episcopal, Anglican, Church. Josiah moved to New England, Boston, with his first wife and children to practice their new religion freely. Josiah had more children with his first wife and 10 more with Franklin's mother, Abia Folger. Abia Folger and Peter Folger. Abia, Franklin's mother, was the daughter of Peter Folger, one of the first settlers of New England. Peter Folger dabbled in writing and was mentioned by historian Cotton Mather in Magnalia Christi Americana. Franklin recalls reading a well-written political poem attributed to his grandfather. Franklin's education and early ambitions. Franklin attended grammar school at the age of 8, with the initial intention of becoming a priest. Due to the expense of college education, he was transferred to a school for writing and arithmetic. Franklin disliked his father's trade, candle and soap making, and aspired to become a sailor. Anecdote of boyhood mischief. Franklin's early public spirit led him to organize a group of boys to steal cobblestones for building a small wharf. Caught and reprimanded, Franklin learned the value of honesty and usefulness in his actions. Josiah, Franklin's father. Josiah, Franklin's father, had a strong physical build, musical talents, and sound judgment. He often invited friends and neighbors over for dinner, choosing topics of conversation to improve his children's minds. Franklin's interest in these conversations influenced his eating habits and later travels. Abia, Franklin's mother. Abia, Franklin's mother, also had a strong constitution. Neither of Franklin's parents suffered from sickness except for what ultimately led to their deaths. They are buried together in Boston, with a loving inscription on their tombstone. Franklin's upbringing. Franklin was apprenticed to various tradesmen, observing and learning from them. His love for reading, cultivated from an early age, played a significant role in shaping his intellectual pursuits. His apprenticeship with his brother James, a printer, provided access to better books and fueled his curiosity. Franklin's poetry and prose. Benjamin Franklin developed an interest in poetry and wrote a few pieces. His friend James encouraged him to pursue it. Franklin wrote 2 occasional poems, Lighthouse Tragedy and a sailor song about the taking of Teach, Blackbeard the pirate. Although the poems were not great, Lighthouse Tragedy sold well, boosting Franklin's vanity. Josiah, Franklin's father, ridiculed his verses, warning that poets were often beggars. Franklin decided to focus on prose writing instead. Debates and writing improvement. Franklin had a bookish friend named John Collins. They debated and argued. Collins believed educating women was improper, while Franklin took the opposing view. Collins was more eloquent in arguments, and they exchanged letters on the subject. Josiah pointed out Franklin's lack of elegance and expression, prompting Franklin to improve his writing. Studying Samuel Johnson's style. Franklin found Samuel Johnson's The Spectator and used it to enhance his writing. He rewrote and imitated Johnson's style, translating prose into verse and back. Franklin identified small points of improvement in his expression. Vegetarianism and book fund. At 16, Franklin adopted a vegetarian diet after reading a book by Tryon. His vegetarianism inconvenienced James, so Franklin managed his own food preparation. He saved money from what his brother paid for food and used it to buy books. Advantage of preparing his own meals. Benjamin Franklin found an advantage in preparing his own meals. When his brother and others left for longer, heavier meals, Franklin remained in the printing house alone. This gave him additional time for study. His temperance in eating and drinking contributed to clearness of head and quicker apprehension. Franklin used this extra time to teach himself arithmetic, which he had failed to learn in school. Studying language and writing. Franklin continued to improve his language and writing skills. He studied from an English grammar book that included sketches on rhetoric and logic, along with an example of a dispute using the Socratic method, question-based argumentation. The Socratic method and reserved style. Franklin loved the Socratic method, which made him less argumentative and contradictory. He adopted the air of the humble inquirer and doubter. Franklin retained the habit of expressing himself modestly, using phrases like, "it appears to me," rather than absolute certainty. Effective communication style. Franklin found his reserved style helpful in persuading others. He wished more men would adopt this style, as a dogmatic manner can provoke contradiction. Franklin quoted poet Alexander Pope to illustrate his point. James Franklin's newspaper and Franklin's writing. James Franklin started printing the New England Courant, the second newspaper in America. Despite objections from James's friends, Franklin was employed to carry the newspaper through the streets. Franklin decided to try writing for the paper anonymously, fearing his brother's objection. His first essay was well received, leading to more approved submissions. Franklin eventually revealed himself as the author, causing differences and disagreements with his brother. Disputes and apprenticeship. Franklin and James often took their disputes before their father, Josiah. Josiah generally sided with Franklin, who was either right or a better pleader. Seeking a way out of his apprenticeship, Franklin dealt with physical beatings from his brother. James Franklin's newspaper and assembly conflict. James Franklin published a piece in his newspaper that offended the assembly in Boston. James was imprisoned for a month because he refused to reveal the author of the offending paper. Benjamin Franklin, who wrote the piece, went unpunished. Upon James's release, the assembly ordered that James Franklin should no longer print the paper called the New England Courant. Franklin's escape and New York journey. James's friends suggested changing the paper's name, but James decided to publish it under Benjamin Franklin's name. Franklin was released from his apprenticeship to avoid assembly censure. Another quarrel arose between Franklin and James, leading Franklin to decide not to remain apprenticed to his brother. Franklin went to New York City, where he had offended some assembly members with his publications in James's paper. He reached New York at the age of 17, with little money and no recommendations. Franklin's encounter during the storm. Franklin helped a drunken Dutchman who fell overboard during a storm. The man asked Franklin to dry his Dutch copy of The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Franklin commented on Bunyan's novelistic technique and mentioned other authors who used similar methods. The boat journey and communication challenges. The boat neared Long Island but couldn't find a place to land. People on shore shouted hello, but wind and surf made communication impossible. Franklin's party signaled for canoes to fetch them, but the people on shore didn't understand or ignored them. Franklin and others slept on the boat despite wet conditions. Franklin's struggles and illness. The next day, the wind subsided, and Franklin's party decided to head for Amboy. They had been without food or drink for 30 hours, surviving on dirty rum. Franklin, feeling feverish, drank cold water and felt better. He was told he could find boats to Philadelphia and Burlington, so he walked the 50 miles from Amboy to Burlington. Encounters in Burlington. Franklin spent a night at an inn where he regretted leaving home. People suspected him of being a runaway. Dr. Brown, an innkeeper, was friendly and knowledgeable about European cities. Franklin was glad Dr. Brown never published a Bible parody that might have hurt weak minds. Boating to Philadelphia. Franklin reached Burlington, but found the boats to Philadelphia had already left. An old woman offered him shelter until he could catch another boat. While walking by the river, Franklin found a boat going to Philadelphia and boarded it. The new boating party rowed until midnight, eventually arriving near Philadelphia. Arrival in Philadelphia. Franklin arrived in Philadelphia with very little money. His pockets were stuffed with clothes and stockings. He had only a Dutch dollar and a shilling in copper. He gave the shilling to the boatman for his passage, but they refused because Franklin had rowed. Franklin insisted, believing that sometimes a man with little is more generous to avoid appearing destitute. Buying bread. Franklin walked up Market St. and met a boy with bread. He asked the boy to point out the baker's shop. Franklin bought 3 large rolls from the baker on 2nd Street. He tucked 1 roll under each arm and ate the third as he continued walking. He passed by Mr. Reed's door, who would later become his future wife's father. Quaker Meeting House. Standing at Mr. Reed's door, Ms. Reed saw Franklin and thought he looked ridiculous. Franklin turned down Chestnut Street and part of Walnut Street, eating his roll along the way. Eventually, he found himself back at the Market St. Wharf. There, he gave his 2 extra rolls to a woman and child who had come down on the boat with him. Refreshed, Franklin walked up the street again and joined the well-dressed people of the town. He followed them into the Quaker Meeting House, sat down, looked around, heard nothing, and fell asleep. Someone woke him up at the end of the meeting, seeking lodging and employment. Franklin went back out on the street and met a young Quaker man. He asked the man where he might find lodging. The man showed him a house called the 3 Mariners, though it was a house of ill repute. The man then invited Franklin to follow him to another house, the Crooked Billet on Water St. Franklin ate dinner there and responded to inquiries from people who suspected he was a runaway. Later, Franklin went to bed early, slept soundly, and prepared to seek employment. Meeting Andrew Bradford. Franklin made himself presentable and went to Andrew Bradford the printers. Bradford's father, William Bradford, a printer in New York, was there. William introduced Franklin to his son, who gave Franklin breakfast. However, he informed Franklin that there was no employment available because the position had already been filled. William directed Franklin to Mr. Keimer, who had recently set up a competing press in the town. Keimer's employment offer. William Bradford introduced Franklin to Keimer. Keimer asked Franklin questions and gave him a task to assess his work. Keimer promised to employ Franklin soon, but had no immediate tasks for him. Bradford secretly kept his identity as Keimer's chief competitor's father. Keimer unknowingly revealed business secrets to Bradford while Franklin observed and learned. Keimer's printing press and elegy. Keimer had an old, broken press and a worn-out font. He was composing an elegy for the deceased printer's apprentice, Aquila Rose. Keimer composed the elegy directly in types without writing it down. Franklin got Keimer's and used press into working order. Franklin returned to Andrew Bradford's, where he received a small job and lodging. Printing work and Keimer skills. Keimer later asked Franklin to print the elegy for Aquila Rose. Keimer had another set of cases and a pamphlet to reprint. Both Bradford and Keimer were poor printers. Bradford struggled due to poor writing and spelling, while Keimer lacked knowledge of presswork. Keimer had no fixed religious beliefs. Lodging and appearance. Keimer didn't want Franklin lodging at Bradford's. Franklin stayed at Mr. Reed's, his future father-in-law's, house. Franklin's clothes and belongings arrived in Philadelphia. He made a respectable appearance for Ms. Reed, his future wife. Franklin began making friends with young literary men in Philadelphia. Sir William Keith's interest. Franklin earned money working for Bradford and Keimer. He lived pleasantly but missed Boston. Franklin's brother-in-law, Robert Holmes, urged him to return to Boston. Franklin explained his reasons for leaving Boston. Sir William Keith, governor of Pennsylvania, was impressed by Franklin's writing and potential. Keith decided to mentor and encourage Franklin. Keith's kindness. Keith invited Franklin to join him and French for Madeira wine at a tavern. Franklin was surprised by Keith's kindness and encouragement. Proposal for printing business. Franklin, Keith, and French discussed Franklin setting up his own printing business. Keith promised support and offered to write a letter to Franklin's father, Josiah. Franklin was to return to Boston with Keith's letter to propose the idea to Josiah. Difficult journey and surprise return. Franklin took a ship to Boston with Keith's letter. The ship faced challenges at sea but arrived safely after 2 weeks. Franklin's appearance surprised friends and family, as no news had reached them due to Holmes' absence. James's cold reception. Everyone was glad to see Franklin except his brother James. James received Franklin coldly when he visited James's shop in an elegant suit. James's workers were curious about Franklin's whereabouts. Josiah's reaction. Franklin's father, Josiah, was surprised by Governor Keith's letter. Holmes supported the project, but Josiah rejected it, writing a civil letter to Keith. This series of events marked a pivotal moment in Franklin's life, leading him toward his successful career as a printer and writer. Collins' decision to move to Philadelphia. Franklin's friend Collins, a post office clerk, was pleased with Franklin's description of Philadelphia. Collins resolved to move there with Franklin, leaving his books with him. He proposed that Franklin meet up with him in New York. Josiah's consent and advice. Although Josiah rejected Keith's proposal, he was happy about the attention paid to his son. Josiah advised Franklin to be well-behaved, respectful, and gain the esteem of the people in Philadelphia. He encouraged Franklin to pursue steady industry and wise spending. Franklin's journey and anxiety. Franklin set out again in a sloop that stopped in Newport, Rhode Island. A friend of Franklin's brother, John, asked him to pick up money owed in Philadelphia. Handling such a large sum caused Franklin anxiety. Quaker woman's advice. On the ship, Franklin encountered 2 young women and a grave Quaker woman. The Quaker woman advised him to avoid the company of the young women, whom she considered bad. Near implication in a crime. Upon arriving in New York, the women invited Franklin to their place, but he declined. A silver spoon and other items went missing, and a warrant was drafted. Thanks to the Quaker woman, Franklin narrowly avoided being implicated in the crime. Meeting Collins in New York. Franklin found his friend Collins in New York. Although they had read similar books, Collins had superior math skills. Unfortunately, Collins had taken to drinking and was drunk every day since arriving in New York. Governor Burnet's interest. The governor of New York, Burnet, heard about Franklin's books and treated him with civility. This was the second governor who took an interest in Franklin. Arrival in Philadelphia. The sloop proceeded to Philadelphia, where Franklin received Vernon's money. Collins, unable to find work due to alcoholism, continued to stay with Franklin at Franklin's expense. Collins borrowed from Franklin, promising to repay once he found work. Franklin's journey was filled with interesting encounters and challenges, shaping his path toward success. Franklin and Collins' quarrel. Collins and Franklin had disagreements related to drinking. Franklin recounts an incident where he threw Collins overboard on a boat in the Delaware River because Collins refused to row. The boys punished Collins by rowing away from him whenever he swam near the boat. This event marked the end of their friendship. Collins later went to Barbados to serve as a tutor, but never repaid the money he owed Franklin. Dipping into Vernon's money. Franklin considered using Vernon's money one of the first great mistakes of his life. Josiah, Franklin's father, believed Franklin was too young to manage business affairs. Governor Keith offered to set Franklin up in business since Josiah wouldn't do so. Keith promised to provide what Franklin needed from England. Franklin's voyage and Keith's promises. Franklin prepared an inventory of items he'd need, totaling £100 sterling. Keith suggested that Franklin go to England himself to acquire the items. Franklin continued working for Keimer while waiting for the ship Annis to sail to England. Franklin and Keimer's relationship. Before Franklin's voyage to England, he and Keimer got along well. Keimer didn't know Franklin's plan to set up his own press. They often argued over ideas, and Franklin used the Socratic method to challenge Keimer. Keimer proposed setting up a new religious sect, with Franklin as the confuter. Keimer's sect and Franklin's conditions. Keimer adhered to specific practices, including a long beard and observing the Sabbath on Saturday. Franklin disagreed with these points. They agreed that Franklin would adopt them if Keimer accepted a vegetarian diet. Keimer doubted his constitution could handle it, but Franklin insisted otherwise. Franklin and Keimer. They lived by the tenets of their new faith for 3 months. Franklin fared well, but Keimer grew tired of the project and ordered a roast pig. He invited Franklin and 2 women to dine, but ate the whole pig before they arrived. Franklin's friends. His best friends were Charles Osborne, Joseph Watson, and James Ralph. Osborne and Watson were clerks, while Ralph was a merchant's clerk. They all loved reading and often went on walks together in the woods near Schuylkill. Ralph's poetry. Ralph wanted to be a poet, but Osborne criticized him. The 4 friends decided to compose pieces for their next meeting. Franklin failed to produce one, so Ralph suggested he take Ralph's work and pretend it was his own. Osborne praised it highly, revealing his prejudice against Ralph. Ralph's transformation. After the trick, Ralph resolved to become a poet, but eventually became a good prose writer. Watson died in Franklin's arms, and Osborne went to the West Indies, where he became a notable lawyer but died young. Governor Keith's plan. Governor Keith set up a plan to give Franklin letters of recommendation to his friends in England and a letter of credit for his printing press. However, when Franklin called to take leave for England, Keith's secretary informed him that Keith would send the letters to him while he was on board. Ralph's abandonment. Ralph, though married with a young child, decided to go with Franklin on the journey. Franklin discovered later that Ralph had abandoned his wife and child. Andrew Hamilton and Mr. Denham. On the ship, Andrew Hamilton, the famous lawyer, and his son James Hamilton were also present. A Quaker merchant named Mr. Denham became Franklin's good friend. Andrew Hamilton was called to plead a case just before the ship sailed and left the rest of the company his supplies. These anecdotes provide fascinating insights into Franklin's life and relationships during that time. Arrival in London and letters incident. Upon arriving in London in December 1774, Franklin was given a bag of letters by the ship's captain. He found none addressed to him, but several that seemed to be from Keith. However, a printer named Basket dismissed one of the letters as coming from a disreputable person named Riddlesden. Advice from Denham. Franklin confided in his friend Denham about his frustrations. Denham advised Franklin that Keith was unreliable and suggested that Franklin improve himself with the printers in England for a better future in America. Friendship with Ralph. Franklin became close friends with Ralph, who decided to stay in London and abandon his family. Ralph borrowed money from Franklin while job hunting, but failed to find work as an actor or writer. Employment at Palmer's and financial struggles. Franklin found employment at a printer's called Palmer's and worked there for a year. Despite earning, he spent much of his money on attending plays with Ralph and was unable to save enough for his return to Philadelphia. He also forgot his engagement to Ms. Red, which he later regretted. Philosophical writings. Franklin wrote a philosophical piece in response to a work he said at Palmer's. Although Palmer acknowledged Franklin's ingenuity, he disagreed with the ideas in Franklin's pamphlet. Acquaintances in Little Britain. While living in Little Britain, Franklin befriended Mr. Wilcox, who allowed him to borrow books from his extensive library. Franklin's pamphlet was read by a surgeon named Lyons, who introduced Franklin to several notable individuals. However, Franklin's desire to meet Sir Isaac Newton remained unfulfilled. Curiosities and interaction with Sir Hans Sloane. Franklin brought several curiosities with him to London, including a fire-purifying asbestos purse. Sir Hans Sloane took interest in these items and invited Franklin to his house to view his collection of curiosities. Franklin ended up selling the asbestos purse to Sloane. Intimate relations and identity theft. A young woman, Mrs. T., a milliner, lived in the same house as Franklin and Ralph. They became intimate and moved in together. Ralph, still out of work, decided to become a teacher at a country school. Franklin later discovered that Ralph had begun using the name Benjamin Franklin because he felt his career ignominious, unworthy. Broken friendship over unrequited advances. Ralph wrote Franklin frequently, including excerpts from an epic poem he was writing. Franklin tried to discourage him from pursuing poetry. Ralph asked Franklin to look in on Mrs. T, and Franklin grew fond of her and made advances, another erratum. She refused him, told Ralph, and it was the end of Franklin and Ralph's friendship. He never got the money Ralph owed him. Transition to Watts's and workplace challenges. Franklin left Palmer's to work at a printer called Watts's near Lincoln's Inn Fields, where he continued the rest of his stay in London. Franklin saved a good deal of money and kept himself healthy by drinking water at work. All the other workmen drank beer. Franklin was moved from the press room to the composing room by Watts and was asked to pay in for beer, which he didn't drink. He held out paying, and the other workers played tricks on him until he, at last, conceded to the fee. Workplace reforms and good standing. Franklin reached good standing with the other men and proposed some alterations to their chapel, printing house rules. Following Franklin's example, many of the other workmen gave up beer and switched to more frugal breakfasts. Franklin's being a good rigist, verbal satirist, endeared him to the men. His industriousness made him valuable to the master, so he got on very agreeably. Moving houses and reduced rent. Franklin moved from Little Britain to Duke St. The landlady was an elderly widow and Franklin got along very well with her. Eventually, after Franklin proposed moving to a cheaper apartment closer to his workplace, she liked him so much she reduced his rent to keep him around. Encounter with a maiden woman. Franklin's landlady told him about the maiden woman of 70 who lived in the garret. She, though not a nun, lived as one. She ate only water gruel and gave all her other money to charity. A priest visited to give her confession every day. Franklin asked her, living as she did, why she needed to confess daily. She said, "Oh, it is impossible to avoid vain thoughts." He visited her once and was amazed at how human beings are able to survive with so little. Friendship with Wygate and swimming ventures. At Watts's, Franklin became friends with a young man named Wygate whom he describes as ingenious. Wygate spoke Latin and French, and Franklin taught him to swim. At the request of a company of men Wygate introduced to him, Franklin displayed his great capacities as a swimmer. He says he learned his swimming techniques by studying Thurnov's book on motions and positions. Wygate proposed to Franklin that they should travel all about Europe making money by holding swimming lessons, but Denham dissuaded him. Denham's debt repayment and Franklin's employment. Franklin admires how Denham, who had previously accrued debts in England, moved to the United States and eventually paid back all his debts with interest. Denham, about to return to Philadelphia, proposed to take Franklin as his clerk. Franklin agreed, thinking he was giving up the printing trade forever. Franklin's missed opportunity as a swimming instructor. On one of his days off, Franklin was approached by Sir William Wyndham, who had heard of Franklin's abilities as a swimmer and wished to have his children taught swimming. Franklin had to refuse due to his impending departure. Franklin's 18 months in London. Franklin spent 18 months in London, mostly working at his business, sometimes seeing plays and reading books. His friend Ralph had kept him poor. They sailed from Gravesend on the 23rd of July, 1726. The most important thing that happened on the journey was that he conceived his plan for regulating his future conduct in life. Changes in governance and personal life upon return to Philadelphia. Upon return, Franklin found Keith replaced by Major Gordon as governor. He also found out that Ms. Reed had married another man, Rogers, a potter, who treated her poorly. Franklin's return to business after Denham's death. Mr. Denham took a shop on water. St. Franklin attended business diligently, studied accounts, and grew expert at sailing. After Denham's death, Franklin's brother-in-law, Holmes, advised him to return to business, and Keimer offered him high wages to oversee his shop. Franklin's role in Keimer's shop. Franklin accepted Keimer's offer and began to oversee workmen who were employed at lower wages until they learned the trade. Franklin saw that Keimer wanted to employ him only to teach his men and then cut him loose. Franklin's interaction with Webb. Franklin found it remarkable that the Oxford scholar Webb was there and gives an account of Webb's origins and skill as an actor. Webb skipped out on his debts to become an actor in London, became destitute, and bound himself to service in America. Franklin admired his intelligence and liveliness, but found him idle and imprudent. Franklin's ingenuity and disagreement with Keimer. In America, Where there was no place to cast types, Franklin contrived a mold to do some himself. He engraved on occasion and even made the shop's ink. However, due to the growing proficiency of the other workmen, Keimer tried to get Franklin to take a pay cut after 2 pay cycles. Franklin refused, and they began to not get along. Meredith's proposal to Franklin. Meredith, who loved Franklin and didn't want him to leave, spoke to Franklin of Keimer's debts, told him his father had some money, and suggested that when Keimer inevitably failed as a printer, Franklin and he could become partners and set up their own shop. Franklin agreed, and they kept the deal a secret. Franklin's returned to Keimer's shop in Friendship in Burlington. While Franklin and Meredith waited for their capital to arrive, Keimer got a prospect to print some paper money, which he couldn't do without Franklin. Keimer apologized and hired Franklin back. Franklin went to Burlington to execute the job, and Keimer made a good sum from it. The men in Burlington who oversaw the printing of the money found Franklin to be well-read and well-spoken. Franklin's principles and morals. Franklin digresses to tell about his principles and morals before going on to narrate his public appearance in business. He says that he became a deist early on as a boy and persuaded his friends Collins and Ralph to it. They had treated him badly and he had treated Ms. Red poorly, so he decided that this doctrine, though perhaps true, wasn't useful. He grew convinced that truth, sincerity, and integrity in dealings between men were of the utmost importance and formed written resolutions to practice virtues while he lived. Franklin's character. Franklin says, for the most part, his constitution was suited toward treating others well, and that he began in life with a fairly good character, for which he can thank God's providence. Franklin's return to Philadelphia and first earnings. Franklin returned to Philadelphia before Meredith and his types arrived from London. They left Keimer's service, rented a house near the market, and took on a family of boarders to lessen the rent. Their first earnings came from a customer brought by an acquaintance, George House. Franklin's encounter with a pessimistic old man. Franklin recounts his interaction with an old man who constantly predicted the fall of Philadelphia. Despite his initial discouragement, Franklin found amusement in the fact that the man eventually bought a house in the city he believed was doomed. Formation of the Junto Club. In the previous year's autumn, Franklin formed a club called the Junto, where his friends took turns delivering speeches on morals, politics, and natural philosophy. The club's first members included Joseph Bretnell, Joseph Godfrey, Nicholas Skull, William Parsons, William Mogridge, Hugh Meredith, Robert Grace, and William Coleman. The Junto Club's influence on Franklin's business. Franklin mentions the Junto Club, as it was among the interests that brought him business. In particular, Bretnell got them jobs from the Quakers, including a 40-page history. Franklin's industry in completing these jobs earned him and Meredith character and credit with their neighbors. Public perception of Franklin's industry. Despite predictions of failure, Franklin received praise for his industry from eminent citizens who believed he was sure to succeed. Franklin mentions this to highlight the value of the virtue of industry to his posterity. Franklin's interaction with George Webb and Keimer. George Webb, whose time was purchased from Keimer by a female friend, approached Franklin for work. Franklin couldn't employ him, but mentioned his plan to start a newspaper. Webb shared this plan with Keimer, who proposed to start his own paper, leading Franklin to satirize Webb and Keimer in Bradford's paper. Franklin's acquisition of Keimer's paper. Keimer's paper, which had little success after 9 months, was bought by Franklin for a trifle and proved extremely profitable. Franklin mentions that he speaks in the singular of business affairs because Meredith, being a drunk, hardly contributed to their business. Franklin's first newspapers and dispute with Governor Burnet. Franklin's first newspapers looked better than any that had been published in the colonies before. He gained many subscribers by writing about a dispute between Governor Burnet of Massachusetts and the Massachusetts Assembly. Leading men, seeing a newspaper in the hands of someone who could write well, encouraged him. Franklin's debt and split with Meredith. At this time, Vernon wrote to Franklin about his debt. Franklin paid the balance with interest after asking for a little time. However, Mr. Meredith, who was to have paid in full for starting the printing house, only advanced half the total, leaving Franklin with the debt. Thankfully, 2 true friends lent him the money and the business was saved. They insisted he split with Meredith, who was often drunk in public. Meredith's departure and Franklin's newspaper reports. Meredith acknowledged to Franklin that he wasn't fit to be a printer and allowed Franklin to buy him out of his partnership. Meredith went south to become a farmer and sent back reports of the Carolinas that Franklin published in his newspaper. The reports pleased the public. Franklin's advocacy for more paper money. At that time, the people wanted more paper money. The wealthy opposed any addition because they worried that the currency would depreciate. Franklin wrote and argued for more paper money, even publishing a pamphlet entitled The Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency. Franklin's reward for advocacy and new jobs. Eventually, partly due to the success of Franklin's pamphlet, the Assembly resolved to print more paper money. His friends in the House gave Franklin the reward of printing the new money. His friend Alexander Hamilton also procured for him the job of printing money in Newcastle and the job of printing the laws and votes there. These money printing and government jobs were very profitable. Franklin's stationery shop and new apprentice. With these jobs in hand, Franklin opened a stationery shop. A man named Whitemarsh, a compositor Franklin knew in London, came to Franklin in Philadelphia and worked for him. He also took an apprentice, the son of Aquila Rose. Franklin began to pay off the debt he was under for the printing house. Franklin's industriousness and Keimer's downfall. Franklin took care both to be and seem industrious. Because people saw this, they were more likely to give him business. Keimer's business suffered, and he was forced to sell his printing house. He moved to Barbados and lived there some years in poor circumstances. Harry's takeover and Franklin's only competitor. Keimer's apprentice, David Harry, set up in Keimer's place. At first, Franklin feared Harry as a rival and proposed a partnership which, thankfully for Franklin, Harry refused. Harry lived lavishly and ran up his debt and ended up following Keimer to Barbados. Franklin's only competitor now was Andrew Bradford, who was rich and easy. Bradford's influence on Franklin's newspaper business. Bradford, who ran the post office, was perceived to have faster access to news, which attracted more advertisers to his paper. He prevented Franklin from distributing his newspapers through the post, leading Franklin to bribe the writers. Failed engagement with the Godfreys. The Godfreys, who were Franklin's boarders, attempted to arrange a marriage between Franklin and a relative's daughter. However, the engagement fell through due to their refusal to provide a suitable dowry, according to Franklin. Following this, the Godfreys moved out, and Franklin decided not to take in new tenants. Franklin's thoughts on marriage and relationships. The failed engagement led Franklin to contemplate marriage. However, due to the perceived poor prospects of the printing business, he believed he wouldn't receive a suitable dowry. This, coupled with youthful passion, led him to engage with low women, which cost him money and inconvenience. Rekindling affection with Ms. Reed. Franklin maintained a friendly correspondence with the Reeds. He felt sympathy for Ms. Reed's situation, considering himself partly responsible. Their affection rekindled, and despite complications due to Ms. Reed's previous marriage, they overcame the obstacles and married on September 1, 1730. Establishment of a subscription library. The junto began meeting in a small room of Mr. Grace's, where Franklin proposed starting a small lending library. After about a year, each member took their books home, leading Franklin to set up a subscription library. With the help of the junto, he secured 50 subscribers for the library, which eventually grew to 150 members and obtained a charter. Conclusion of Part 1. Part 1 of the autobiography, written for family, concludes with a note stating that the subsequent part was written many years later, following the advice contained in 2 included letters. The writing was interrupted by the American Revolution.